Hello, and welcome back to Parley, a series where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the question of your choice, and this month, Pingers has chosen attributes. You know, like the stat thing that's in like every RPG system because of Dungeons and Dragons. We're talking about like the strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, charisma, that thing. So Pinger says, to put it another way, do those stats cover the right amount of conceptual ground for what D&D games tend to care about? What about other similar games? Could we lose an entire attribute or two and not miss it? Would the game benefit from more attributes to allow for more varied characters, or to spread out the kinds of bonuses and skills worth focusing on, assuming in either case that the point buy math and arrays get sensibly adjusted in kind, of course? I've been interested in this recently, Pingers continues, because I've been fiddling back and forth with the question of what really should matter to the characters in this game throughout drafts of an RPG system I've been working on writing. I also recently read through the draft rules of In the Time of Monsters, which was an indie RPG in development that simplifies its stats down to body, mind, and soul. Ooh. Which really struck me with its simplicity and flexibility. What do we gain by representing an RPG character's innate abilities with a lot of granularity? By adding more stats to a game, can we actually lose or close off too much of the design space to self-justification? That's an interesting concluding point. Sure, an interesting question. I'll do my very best to answer it. Yes, I think that something important to acknowledge out of the gate is that Dungeons & Dragons has a bit of a popularity bias. It is something that many of us are very used to, or at least aware of. You've probably played more games, even if you haven't played Dungeons & Dragons. You've probably played more games that are more similar to D&D's stats system than something that is completely different, if that makes sense. I'm actually going to give you a few quick examples of variants right now. The body, mind, and soul thing I'm going to come back to a lot as well. That's a really useful example. A fellow Parley patron, True Mr. Fruit, you mentioned Disco Elysium, which I think is a great example. Disco Elysium has 4 stats. Basically, your intelligence and how you use it, and your body and how you use it. Kind of, you could call them, like intelligence, wisdom, constitution, dexterity, sort of. And that's kind of a condensation of D&D's stats. Disco Elysium then has each of the skills, kind of like D&D's big list of skills, under a stat category. And so that's quite simple. It is kind of an adaptation of D&D's version, but it's a different approach. Rather than dividing things into various domains, physical and mental, it's sort of like, this is your physical stat, but this is how you use your physical stat. This is your mental stat. This is how you use your mental stat. I would say strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma are more like, these are the 3 parts of your physicality, and these are the 3 parts of your mentality. And so you can divide them up like that. You could also, this body, mind, and soul example, well, these are stats that say this is all the physical stuff, all the mental stuff, and then the soul thing. This gets us into another discussion about, like you said, what the characters in the game are going to find important. I also think it's important to think about what the players will find important. When you make stats, you're influencing what the player will build, or what is apparently important in that game. And players, what players of these games consider important, is also going to influence what stats they actually use. Would you like a conspiracy theory? There are so many charisma casters in Dungeons & Dragons, and charisma is such a seemingly extra stat to some people because the game developers know that the weakness of a lot of D&D playgroups is communication. And so they made the stat that is focused on that a little bit of a gimme for like slightly more of the classes. Do I know that they actually did that? No, but it sounds pretty reasonable, doesn't it? Maybe they did do that on purpose. I don't know. You could see that as a bit extraneous, I suppose. You could look at Disco Elysium stats, those 4, and say, all right, well, which ones, how do they condense D&D's stats? And that could be a place to start looking at which one to remove. But that could also highlight whether there's something lost by removing them. So let's do that. Well, we've got, I actually don't remember what they're called in Disco Elysium, but anyway, we've got your mental ability and how you use it. I would argue in D&D that's intelligence and wisdom, respectively, condensing out charisma, sort of. I bet Disco Elysium would argue that those two stats and your relationship to them is what your personality is. So there's no need for another stat that does that. The combination of the two results in the third thing. You don't need another stat that expresses that third thing. That's kind of a composite, maybe they'd argue. And then your body and how you use it, the stat that is your body in Disco Elysium is very much strength and constitution combined together. And then motorics, I remember what that one is, that's how you use your body, is dexterity, of course. At least that's what I would argue. And so that means you're kind of condensing out strength or constitution. A whole other aspect of this condensing or expanding stats thing is what the game already has in it. And of course, if you expand your stats, you get more game design. So a way to flip that around is, well, if there's a game that has these stats but isn't using them for design space, they should be removed. That's one way you could think of it. I don't know, but let's do that quickly. So in Dungeons & Dragons, I think that strength and constitution are very underused. Now, constitution, you might immediately be thinking, hold on, people use that for lots of stuff. Non-D&D folks, constitution is used for whenever a spellcaster is focusing on a spell and takes damage. They roll a constitution save to represent them trying to maintain focus on that spell. Sounds pretty mental, doesn't it? And it's also quite common with poison to make a constitution save. Can you have better constitution and just not die to poison? Because I kind of think you mostly can't. I'm aware that there is a medical phenomenon where you could be like determined to stay alive, but I'm sure most medical professionals, which I am not one of, would tell you, I'm guessing, that that's kind of like an edge case. It's pushing you over the edge. If you're close to staying alive, maybe, but if you take some deadly snake venom, you can't just like be like sturdy or whatever and not die. At least, anyway, that's a miracle. I would argue that that is either a bit of the domain of strength or it's very standard. In other words, it's just a quality of mortality. It's not something that you have dramatically more of, which I think is another quality where ability scores could be removed. Let's back up for a moment. I've just laid out a whole bunch of stuff, and these are all things that you could use as ways to think about which ability scores to remove. What about which ones to add? So this body, mind, and soul thing, well, the soul part, it suggests that this is a system that will be in a world where the characters will be using that ability. Their spirituality will be a big deal. You could organize D&D's classes into body, mind, and soul if you wanted to. Let's do that. So barbarians, warriors, rangers, and rogues, I guess, can be body, and wizards, sorcerers, warlocks, and artificers, blood hunters, if you want to count them, could be mind, and then clerics, paladins, druids, and monks could be soul. We have physical, mental, and spiritual focused archetypes. And the reason I did that is just to demonstrate that you don't actually have to have like an overly spiritually focused game compared to D&D for soul to have like enough design space. But I do think there's a question about whether players will go for that. Now, part of your question, Pingers, at least this is how I'm interpreting it, and I hope that it's okay if I talk about this, is that you're trying to make a sort of omni campaign. You're trying to make a system that gets at the heart of like an archetypical role-playing game. And so I think that if you were trying to do that, then it's important to think about what players, I would almost say, objectively use, and design a game around those things. You could also look at a game's design to do that. In Dungeons & Dragons, for example, if you remove each stat in turn, you can look at like how much of the game would need to change to adapt for that. So for example, you could remove strength and not that much has to change. But if you remove dexterity, for most characters, that's their initiative, their AC. A lot of characters are using that to roll to hit, some melee and ranged characters. That's a lot. You remove constitution, you could just kind of standardize health. I don't know why that's number 4. If you remove intelligence, that's general knowledge stuff, but it is pretty contained. Intelligence is pretty monolithic. Wisdom is like perception, these pretty large things. Charisma is a social stat that some people just don't even use that much. some DMs don't even have you roll that often, is kind of what I meant. So you can see how certain design elements are more or less baked into those games. You could argue that dexterity in D&D is objectively the most valuable overall stat, and there are some things the game has done to kind of balance that out. You can make a build where that's not true, but if you make every build, it is mostly true on average. That's which you can't do, of course, but you get what I'm trying to say. A lot of design space in the game is taken up by that. When you see a stat in a game where, again, the design space isn't being used, I do think that's a hint that perhaps that could be a stat that could be removed. But about adding stats, I think it's important to come back to skills. In Disco Elysium, I talked about how, like in True Mr. Fruit's example, this is a system where you've got 4 main stats, and then the skills, how you use that stat, are within each of those stats. And D&D does it that way too. There are 6 and then a bunch of skill checks that use various of those stats. I think it's quite interesting and significant that many of those skills actually don't use certain stats. Constitution isn't in any of those checks. Plenty of spells make you roll a Constitution saving throw, but you as the player can't use your Constitution for stuff, at least according to your character sheet. You can in practice. In D&D, usually if you do a forced march, if you walk really far, that's generally ruled as Constitution. Couldn't it be Strength? I think it could be Strength. So you could kind of condense that. And again, I think it's telling that it isn't something the player can actually use that much, but it's like your health. And so most people don't dump it, but you well could. And I think that's quite telling. So I don't know. I mean, if you forced me to remove a stat from D&D, which I think is a very good design prompt, you didn't say that, but Constitution would be my vote. There's a lot of stuff Constitution is used for, but I'm arguing that you could standardize those things. You don't really need there to be a stat that determines them, and you could then give Strength more design space, which I would argue is warranted. That would help D&D's balance. It would be a better balanced game if Strength did more. Buffing Strength would be good, I would argue. So that's an interesting way to think of it, but that's a quite responsive approach. That's an approach where I'm taking a game that already exists and saying, well, relative to that, you could make these changes to balance it out. But I do also think that's reflective of how people play D&D to some extent. So making it from the ground up is hard in a new way. Any new system you make is going to have this uphill battle comparing itself to the system people are already used to. It's going to have to be more better than it would normally need to be just to overcome the comfort bias of people already understanding a way of doing it differently, if that makes sense. Or it'll be understood from the perspective of other systems. I do also want to say that I think the words themselves matter a lot, especially if you're making a new system that players are not used to. The tone or the expressiveness of the words, the onomatopoeia of the language, does make a big difference. This is a minor point, but looking at the English words strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, charisma, they sound like what they are. They have excellent onomatopoeia, these words. I've seen games that swap intelligence and wisdom. Intelligence is your learned knowledge, and wisdom is your book smarts. Now, there's an argument that that's literally not what those words mean, but all words are made up, and the meaning of a word is a composite of how everybody uses it. I would just argue that objectively, people do not actually use those words that way a significant amount. Intelligence, therefore, objectively doesn't mean that. Sure, but there's a reason it doesn't mean that. There's a reason it's not used that way. I think subtly, intelligence may have became the word it was in very quiet, subtle moments throughout history, because when you use it to mean calculative intelligence, I can't even not say intelligence, book smarts, it just sounds like it. It sounds like a technical word, There's nothing more fitting than there's an artificer class. What stat does it use? Intelligence. You just sort of, it's called the artificer, So the English words do a lot there. Body, mind, and soul. 3 4-letter words, nice blunt terms. It really gives the player a tone for what the game is going to be like, And I personally think that this aspect of game design is quite meaningful. There's an element, especially if you're making a game from the ground up rather than editing a game, which is, every new edition of D&D really is editing a previously existing game. D&D 5th edition isn't a new game in that sense, but you're trying to maybe make like new things. And so what those things are framed as is important. That's valuable. Do you want your game to be something simpler or more complicated? You can do that just in the verbiage of the way that the words are written. Of course, the way English is structured, broadly speaking, if a term is more vague, there is a correlation with it being smaller as well. More specific words are often simply longer in English, whereas these archetype concepts are, shorter syllable words. It's not a coincidence that body, mind, and soul are these broadish things about the human experience, and they are small words. So I do think that's an element as well. Now, when I talk about Parley, my goal in some respect is to provide some kind of takeaway, something you can use, something that you can hold on afterward and say, this kind of in a tiny way moved the conversation forward or improved something a little bit. The build that is this mindset, your build for making an RPG has in some way maybe improved by the end. That's, kind of my goal. And so I'm trying to bring it back a little bit. And that was a bunch of stuff. There's a lot of ways you can tweak design that way. But what do you do? So again, I do think there's a way in which the 6 stat thing does mimic the way the game is played. I think it's good to move to pragmatism here. If you have a 4-3-4 player party, and there are 6 different stats, and 2 of them are pretty core to the game's function, Constitution and Dexterity in D&D, then, 4 open stats, 4 different characters, it vaguely fits. A lot of them will use Dexterity and Constitution, especially Constitution, but Strength, Intelligence, Charisma, and to a lesser extent Wisdom are more niche, and that allows players different places to fit in. I'd reckon that size, and having literally just like 1 stat for each person, is pretty good. That's a pretty unassailable design choice in a certain sense. Now, again, you could design a game where there aren't these hyper general stats. You could take Disco Elysium and make like a D&D-ish system out of it. And then each player would maybe have on average 1 of the 4. You could get parties that doubled up on 1 and skipped 1 or whatever, of course. People spread out between 2 or something like that. Yeah, but on average, it would give people, the right amount of design space, where it's pretty easy to have most of the things without trying, but people have individual strengths, again, mostly without trying, and your party isn't going to massively lack gigantic swaths of the game unless they do so on purpose, is the hope. It also depends how your game's specialization works. What kind of pressure do you want to put on players being good and bad at stuff? I would argue that part of the point of these games is to provide role-playing prompts. And so these adequately specific terms that are not too specific but not too general help the player make a character that feels like they are that thing. For a moment, imagine a person that is the archetype of strength. This could be in fiction, in real life, in a game, or just in a show you watch. And I think we can all imagine like someone who epitomizes strength, even if it's a bit of a caricature. Of course, right? Like a muscle person, or whatever, Personally, I can also imagine someone with high dexterity, or a person that is charisma, or someone in my life who's embodied wisdom, or a piece of media that had a character that was, in a word, intelligence. But Constitution, And so there's an argument to be made, I'm just attacking Constitution at this point, that Constitution's weakness is that it is not an effective role-playing prompt. I would also argue that this is one of the weak points of the body, mind, and soul thing. I feel like I can definitely imagine a person who, their originating point of their personality is the body. They're a person rooted in the body. Okay, but I don't have that's very non-specific. You see what I'm trying to say? To the point where I would argue that actually isn't really a starting out point. It doesn't really prompt the beginning of a character. You could build a character around body, and then if they're going to have weaknesses, then we've kind of made rock, paper, scissors, and I don't really feel like my character has much of a shape. I'm not really starting from a category of the human experience, except in the most incredibly general way. And that might be a comfort bias from the mindset of someone who's thinking in terms of 6 stats. But I do think that's something to think about. There is, if we could remove all our biases, which we can't, it might be unknowable, but there is, I would argue, some sort of relatively objective medium-ish number of stats that is kind of like the optimal number of stats. And is it 6? I don't know. 6 sounds like a decent number. Like 5? I'm just drop Constitution. 4, I don't know. But then skills as well. Part of the role here is also to provide a sufficient framework. I think that if you're going to design your own system, you also have to decide what RPGs are for. You said what really should matter to characters in this game. What are players using the system for? I think it's a framework partially for role playing. If you take all games and try to make these types of games good at what they're uniquely good at, then the stats would be role-playing prompts, which makes it interesting to look at like when a video game takes these stats. There are many games that have like these same 5 or 6 stats that D&D has, but they don't, there's sort of a fundamental disconnect in purpose there. Why? A lot of them do it for the mechanical reason D&D does. There's a few stats that you just kind of generally want, and then a few that are more of a choice. This is a good buildcraft prompt for players. Many games use a buildcraft system where some choices are more obvious and some are less obvious to help invite the player into making choices and to make it feel like they're not always worried about whether anything will pay off, to encourage them to go ahead and take something every so often. It's fun to put a stat point somewhere. It's fun to take a card and add it to your deck. That's just fun. And so good game design often invites the player to have a good stuff stat. I think this is where 3 stats starts to show a bit of pressure. If we want players to be good and bad individual stats, but still maintain a few things that are just kind of good in general, you might want to dump them. That adds a little bit of niche buildcraft variety, but players like having a few things that are just a safe bet. I think it's good to have more stats in that case. I would reckon that means that 6 could be considered a little low, actually. Could we add a 7th? And of course, some of you may know that D&D actually does suggest other stats. Honor is one of the ones as an optional feature. And I don't like it very much. I feel like its purpose is different from the other ones. The other ones are sort of like parameters that make a person, as if you could describe any given person's personality by changing those 6 sliders. And I think honor is much more of like what the world thinks about you, which is not really, you could argue charisma is that way as well. But anyway, or that wisdom is contextual. Your wisdom score goes down if you go to an alien planet, but then you could argue your intelligence score goes down, and everything is relative, and it's relative, of course. So I don't know, that's tricky as well. But the takeaway is this idea that, the game design is built into it, and thinking about what players have a tendency to do, it might be something that feels a bit rote from a game design perspective. It's important not to get too far into abstraction, to come back down and remember that there are things that players simply enjoy, and that might be fine. It might be fine that Constitution is kind of boring from a game design perspective in D&D. At the end of your parlay, you said, I said I thought this was really interesting wording. You said, I'm going to read again. What do we gain by representing an RPG character's innate abilities with a lot of granularity? By adding more stats to a game, can we actually lose or close off too much of the design space to self-justification? Interesting. And so, I don't know. I mean, I think that there's a clear, presentable reason for these stats. And really, when there's like a whole catalog more stuff, personally, I get a bit suspicious that that's only serving to show players what the options are more easily. What I mean is, if you imagine a game with like 12 stats, it's like, why do you need to be so specific? As long as you check all the boxes, there's enough space. Why do you want a lot of stats? To the point where the game is going to allow you to specialize in multiple or massive amounts of the stat pool possible would be missing from a given party. In other words, let's say we're doubling D&D's stats, and we still want that thing where players are good at different things. There's a point in choosing because there are choices. Well, if you double the amount of stats, you either make a game where players are just good at twice as many things, but everything is twice as specific, which means it's literally no different than the previous system. You just made more words. Or you make a system where players aren't good at more things. You now have more specific characters' rules as written, but necessarily that then means that more of your party doesn't do things. You've made 12 stats, but players are no less specialized. So now there are like 6 stats on average in the party that nobody has. Whereas if you went to 6, that just wouldn't happen. The party would have a little gap maybe, but most of the game would sort of be there. This might not be bad. That could create a game that had a very different texture depending on who played it. But I hope I've illustrated how adding more stats that way seems a bit like you're not really accomplishing much. Like there is a certain amount of like the number of people in some way dictates like the number of stats. If it's like about 4 and you want to have 1 or 2 stats that are sort of a gimme, or 1 stat that might not be as popular, well, there you go. Constitution is the gimme, and charisma is the one that might not always be as popular, or you could say strength. And then there are 4 stats to specialize in. Dexterity, I guess, intelligence, wisdom, and either charisma or strength, whichever one you think is less good. And some of them are more obvious, dexterity. Some of them are more niche, intelligence, and different players like different things. Done, So I do think, really what I've done in this parlay is explain why I think D&D is the way it is, and why I feel like other systems don't just need to prove their worth because we're comfortable with D&D, but because there is some sort of fundamental like social practicality math behind having 6 stats. Whether or not that was actually why 6 stats were designed, I don't know, and it doesn't matter. But the reality is that they do fit that role in some way. People even have like names or archetypes for these, like the scout for wisdom, or the face of the party for charisma, someone with some charisma, etc. There are others. People use much more granular terms that I don't think are that helpful. But the point is that there are even sort of roles built around, you're going to have that one wisdom guy and that one charisma guy and, whatever. So personally, I feel that there's really 2 things you could do as a takeaway to make a system, make your own system that has all the benefits of existing systems, but maybe gains something somehow. The first one would be to accept that players like to specialize and that players like a stat that is just a safe bet. That might not mean making another attribute, but you'd want some way to, for example, if you level up in D&D every so often, you get an ability score increase. You can increase a stat, or you can take a feat. And I like that flexibility because it means that players can find a way to make that valuable to them no matter what build they have. I think they did a good job making enough of a variety of feats and different stats that you would never not be able to get something you'd like. But note that it isn't always the same thing. There are feats that aren't a stat point. There are some feats that give you 1 stat point. You could get 2 stat points, and you can get a feat that doesn't give you stat points. So if the player is disinterested in one or more of those things, they're much more likely to have something they'd like. Maybe an interesting approach would be to remove some of the stats, like in D&D, and simply allow the player to increase some other more static attribute. For example, rather than having a constitution stat, you could just say when the player levels up, they can add a point to one of their stats or literally just directly increase their health, like something like that. That feels like it's not going to be bad, and so they have analysis paralysis, they can just do that and it's going to be okay. I would say you would then want to design your game around that. It might not be health either, like what is the sort of basic resource of your game? That could be something to think about. I could imagine doing something like everyone in your game or in your system is a spellcaster, and you can increase one of 4 stats, a physical stat, and then 3 different mental stats, or you can just gain another spell slot every day, something like that. So you can either be more specifically good at the things you're doing or be able to do more things if you're just not sure. The additional spell slot will almost certainly not go wasted, but it's sort of like I'm not sure what to do, just give me some value kind of thing. And the idea that maybe that would make characters that can cast a lot of spells versus characters good at casting a few creates some emergent design. That does create some character variety in a way that Dungeons & Dragons arguably doesn't with its level up system. So that's an option. You might be able to remove a stat, but you're kind of still making a category the player can increase. It's just not like another stat to keep in mind. And this represents characters that are simply more experienced. Something that really bothers me about wisdom in D&D is that it kind of feels like it's something that like older characters should just have relatively more of it. You can gain wisdom at different rates as a living being, but you know what I mean? It's like you should just take the wisdom you'd think you'd have and then multiply it by some multiplier based on your age or something, because you've literally had more experiences. Again, wisdom doesn't work linearly with age. There are many very unwise old people and many very wise young people, or you could word it as like people learn how to learn at very different rates to very different degrees. There are people who never abstract that and never become meaningfully wise. There are people who were like that from the beginning of their life, and that's how they live their life. But it does still correlate with like the experiences you've simply had. And an elegant solution to that would be to allow the player to increase just like their breadth period, like almost like their action points or something. There are games that instead of giving you like an action, movement, and a bonus action, they give you a number of points with which to act, and you could simply increase the number of those you have, rather than increasing a stat, which makes the few points you do have more effective. Does that make sense? So that could be a knob to turn. And I think that that is a good way to balance, if you want a different number of stats to achieve some perceived or actual simplicity or complexity, but you still want to allow the player to pick something that feels like a safe choice, you could simply make them have different choices rather than being able to pick from more or less literal stats. And again, this might be a way to add the ability to increase a character's power in a way that doesn't feel like it actually represents the character that much. It would just be something that someone who's done more stuff has. Maybe your magic circuits get stronger if you work them out, but that doesn't really say anything about you as a person. It just means you did more magic. It doesn't make you necessarily more intelligent or wise. It probably makes you one or the other of those things, or both, depending on how magic works in your world. But it doesn't necessarily affect one or the other. It's just practice. Just like you'd get better at hitting with a weapon, and that wouldn't necessarily make the weapon hurt more. You would just like be better at handling it or whatever. And there isn't always a great way to represent that. You can't do more than this amount of damage by swinging a sword, but maybe you can swing the sword more just because you've practiced more. Again, that's kind of a different interpretation, a different abstraction of combat mechanics, which is all these stat systems really are. So that's one thing you could do. And then the second thing I'd want to take away is this idea that like you may or may not decide to tailor your stats around what players will actually focus on. I would argue that the idea of body, mind, and soul, if you ask everybody in the entire world, body and mind are pretty hard to negotiate with. But soul, a lot of people just kind of bounce off that. I don't know if that's bad. Again, I feel like charisma, what's the weakness of most D&D groups? Communication. And so what's a stat that in my conspiracy theory, they made a little bit more prevalent than maybe it needs to be, even though it feels a little awkward? Charisma. But I'm not sure that's actually bad. You might say, well, but it would be good if people playing this game focus more on this thing. Maybe I'll design a stat that does that. Or, people don't come in by default looking for this, but there are folks that play role-playing games to do something truly different from what they normally do. I am not a remotely religious person normally, but I might want to play a game to be that thing I'm not normally. Or, for example, I'm not religious normally because I don't believe that it makes any sense, like that there is any divine or spiritual presence in our reality. But if I'm in the world of my D&D campaign, there literally are gods. There are literally gods. It's not like a subject of debate whether the gods are real in my world. In some D&D campaigns it would be, but like clerics literally do magic. You have seen them do magic. There's like not really much debating that they are getting their power from somewhere that is effectively a god. And so there's a different kind of, it would be interesting to have a religious experience. I just arguably can't have one in this reality. Maybe that's good. Maybe it's good that that doesn't relate to a lot of people, because you're adding something in that is like the least, a little more, and then the most outside of people's comfort zones, But I would want to design those things with intent. This feels like a playtesting thing to me. Do players in the system you've created like want a way to express this character concept? It's hard. But you could design a game that tried to only include the things that everybody would do, and then let players homebrew or adapt the systems you have to represent characters that aren't in there. There's in D&D, there really aren't any mechanics around fighting by kicking things. Fighting is all done with your hands. But like, what the hell? Why? Why don't you just kick stuff? And the answer is, well, no particular reason. It's just easier to abstract by having like 1 and 2 hand for the combat stuff you hold or whatever. Kicking things is a weird trade-off that in real life is really much more about preference, but it's very difficult to represent that in D&D. And so the game has decided to say it wouldn't be helpful to create a system to guide players about that. They're gonna have to figure it out for themselves, which that is a decision. I no more questions, please. So I don't know. I hope that helps. I think this is a really interesting subject. It's really hard to make a system like this. I think, D&D, it's important to remember, has been iterated many times. And I really just wanted to double highlight this idea that the mechanics in these games kind of shape how these things will be interpreted. Like, people have an idea of dexterity, but when you actually play D&D, the idea of dexterity does change a bit. It feels very normal. In real life, it is unremarkable to find a strong person, but it is remarkable to find a highly dexterous person, I would argue. In D&D, it's the opposite because of the game design, because of the game balance. Is that good? Would adventurers trend toward being more dexterous? Maybe that makes sense. You said what really matters the characters in this game, or in an RPG game like this. Yeah, maybe it makes more sense to be more dexterous like that. I don't know, and do you want to represent fantasy archetypes, change people's perspective? Or do you want a game that responds to what people expect, but then turns it into a fantasy world, if that makes sense? Just as a quick little closing thought, recently we had a parlay about isekai, sending people to another world shows in anime. And also the concept of like a reverse isekai, taking someone from a to us fantasy world, or from the past or future, and putting them into our modern time, our modern world. Pretty common trope in fiction in general, not just in anime. It's just been very popular in anime over the past a lot of years. And I think this is an interesting version of that problem. Really what you're doing is allowing the player to insert a piece of themselves translated into a character in your system, into a world. And your stats and the rules of the game are the abstractions, the hand of the author saying, the person in the other world just knows the language because shut up. And they don't have to like grow up in that other world because that would be boring to watch. And whatever. And all of those plot contrivances are ridiculous until the show is awesome. If it's cool, the audience will just shut up about all that stuff. And I think that's the case here. Like, to some extent, I think that the stats sort of don't matter, which is why personally I'm more highly recommending design choices about the game rather than how they abstract like things about human nature. Because as long as the player gets to, choose adequately, there's a medium amount of choice, there's not way too many choices, you still kind of check the boxes of game design, like people having unique niches, there being a stat that's kind of an obviously good choice or something like we were talking about. As long as you do that stuff, I would sort of argue that the rest of it is like the author setting up the story, and it kind of stops mattering after you get your hand in the door. I think this is a big problem with Buildcraft broadly, that a lot of games have deeply interesting Buildcraft before you play, but then it's not interesting while you're playing, or it is suboptimal to choose Buildcraft things while playing. It's more optimal to choose all of that stuff before beginning your time playing, or at the very beginning, which I think is broadly a pitfall with Buildcraft. I would say maybe a third of every interesting Buildcraft thing I've ever played, this was an issue. Like, there are many decision points, but it's inferior to make those decisions at any time other than the beginning of your time playing. So the game has tons of Buildcraft, but if you actually play it, you don't do any Buildcraft, which, so that's a thought as well, finally. Do you want your player to be able to radically change their abilities? There's this concept in D&D of your character kind of changing their alignment. I'm not going to get into alignment here. Maybe even their stats. Over the course of having some character development, they become less of an intelligence-focused person and more of a charismatic person, as they literally just spend more time being social and focus less on they get further away from their mage college education. I don't know. So that's a thought as well. That's something D&D doesn't really do very much, is like changing ability scores. I don't know if that's a great idea, but it's interesting. So I hope that helps. I hope it gives you some ideas. It's really interesting. Good luck making your own system. It'll be interesting to maybe hear about that more in the future. Thanks for watching. Thanks for asking. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.